to the nation last night on the developments in the country's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. President Cyril Ramaphosa also condemned the unrest and violent protests witnessed in parts of KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng over the past few days. Now, the volatile protests are believed to be a result of a group sympathetic to former President Jacob Zuma, who is currently serving a 15-month imprisonment sentence for contempt of court. The Constitutional Court will today also hear the former president's application for a rescission of his sentence. And in his article published by the Sunday Insider, Professor Saths Cooper has described this historic period as the former president's lowest point of his life that will also result in much reflection without the distraction of fawning and mediocre advisors who were alert to and exploited his vulnerabilities. Professor Saths Cooper joins us to talk more on this and also reflect on the possible psychological state, not only of the former president, Jacob Zuma, but also of the country as a whole. Professor Cooper, good morning. Thanks for being with us here on Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina.
So we've woken up to scenes that it really boggles the mind in a democratic dispensation in a country where we thought the fight for liberation was over, but scenes very reminiscent of a period gone by in this country. So looking at what's happening with the increasing COVID-19 cases and deaths as a result of that, how would you describe our current state of mind as South Africans with everything that is going on?
I think there's a great deal of alarm from a significant number of people out there, and there is giving vent to pent-up frustrations and being excluded in South Africa when we brayed about our democracy. We have lost touch with the deep chasm that exists between the bulk of people who have very little to lose and who barely eke out an existence, and the rest of us who are commentators, who are comfortable in our middle class and other surroundings. And so some of the scenes we've seen, I think, are not support for former President Zuma, but it's people who have seen somebody balk at law and order, seen somebody take away something from a store, and have just plainly gone on a rampage to get whatever they can as quickly as possible. But that burning is part of the burning that people have in this country, and particularly young people. We must not ignore the fact that 74.7%, and that is an official government statistic given about a month ago, of young people are out of work and out of school. We should have been terrified by those growing statistics showing the simple deracination, not connected to anything in society that is happening. And the scenes that we are seeing are exemplary of that. They're terrible scenes, and I think the president lost an important opportunity last night to, while dealing with the pandemic, deal with cohesiveness, urging people to come together and not to do the kinds of things they have been doing. Having said that, we also know that protest often ends up with attacks on individuals, attacks on property, and the rampaging we're seeing now is a state that is very, very fragile. And the inability of law and order over time that has resulted in self and other violence and other such attacks have been allowed to continue. And I'm afraid that the police, and we've seen metro police in certain areas, but I'm afraid that the police are overwhelmed currently, and something else needs to happen to put a stop to this. Otherwise, and earlier, much of the media did not play some of the scenes that we've seen on social media. Those are not fake, Mr. President. They are happening. And there's a terror out there from citizens who stand by, watch while their homes and other places are being attacked, which is happening now. And I think that there needs to be some serious intervention, as we saw in March last year, where the military was called to support the police, a police that is overwhelmed. It's about time that in the flashpoint areas, the military was deployed. Otherwise, this will continue, and you will have more such conflagrations in other parts of the country, whereas it's been restricted to the corridor between KZN and Gauteng largely.
Isn't this just, exemplifying the chasms that you speak of in our society, Prof? Because, as you say, we've always spoken in this country, for example, about two economies. We talk about different worlds in which we all live in. There are those who would look at this and say, well, this is just sheer criminality and it needs to be dealt with as such. Others would say, well, we need to look closer at the socioeconomic conditions that give rise to these sort of acts. And as you point out, there have been calls from some quarters for President Cyril Ramaphosa to bring in the South African National Defence Force to support law enforcement authorities as they battle with these protests. But what is the psychological impact of that likely to be on communities, especially given at what happened last year at the beginning of the lockdown when we saw the SANDF being brought in? And unfortunately, there are people, citizens, who died at the hands of these South African National Defence Force members and other law enforcement authorities. So what sort of impact is this likely to have on the psyche of these communities should the SANDF be brought in?
Well, let's be very plain here. The culture of violence has been growing in our society and almost without let. There hasn't been an effort to get to grips with what has given rise to that violence. And every now and then we go on campaigns against, say, for violence against children, against women, and so on. The psyche of South Africa is impacted by violence, violence that is not new to our country and democracy. It started a long time ago, and people have found that violence works because then you get somebody's attention. And we've seen how those people who would like to urge mayhem in the name of former President Zuma will use this violence to get attention. So what we're seeing actually is something that requires a different approach. And I appreciate the violence and the killing in Alexandria last year by certain members of law enforcement. However, we are not facing that situation right now. We are facing COVID. We're at a dangerous level, but we're facing law and order issues which will bring the country down if there is not a clear way forward. And that needs to be demonstrated by this president who seems under siege, and continuing to bury his head in the sand is not going to help us. There needs to be a very clear law and order message where police are out there in full gear, ready to confront persons who take advantage of what began as a protest of support to former President Zuma and which is now just becoming wide scale. None of us can afford that except those who would seek to bring our democracy down.
And Professor Cooper, you also say in that article that the former president's incarceration is a time for healing and self-reflection. Can you briefly explain what you mean by that?
I think we need to say to ourselves, we've come to this pass, and how did we allow this to get here? And all South Africans, if they are concerned about themselves and their country, will be asking this question, how did we get here? We cannot just blame persons who were people who have grown out of relationship with systems, the political, the economic, and other sociocultural systems in the society do not serve the majority of people who live in squalid conditions. And this, Sakina, is a very wealthy country. We can afford to change the conditions of people, enable them to play a different role, change the way they're using violence now to a positive force for being part of this country and showing themselves and the rest of the world that we can disagree, but not be disagreeable, and not in the fashion that we are showing right now, with a whole lot of opportunistic persons taking advantage and fanning the flames. This South Africa cannot afford at this stage in its young democracy.
And just a final one on fanning the flames. And we've seen so many messages doing the rounds on social media, recordings, voice recordings being sent around, and a lot of misinformation at play. How does that impact on the psyche of the nation that is still battling increasing COVID-19 cases and political tensions at this time?
Increased turmoil, increased anxiety. People are stressful, they'll be on edge. This is South Africa's worst moment, compounded by the devastation of COVID. And right now, we need everyone to step back, not participate in such lawless activities. We need leadership to stand up and be counted. And we need to look at putting an end to this huge gap that exists between the majority of our citizens and those few of us who have benefited from this democracy.
Professor Saths Cooper, thanks so much for your time. President of the Pan-African Psychology Union, Professor Cooper, talking to us about the psychological state of our nation at this time when we are battling COVID-19 and also rising political tensions on these shores.